Hello and welcome to this WineGB webinar on preparation for harvest in the vineyard. In case you don't know me, I'm Jo Cowdroy and WineGB's operation manager. Let me introduce you to our two speakers this evening. We have John Pollard from Vineyard Manager at Gusbourne Wine Estate, and we have Joel Jorgensen, who is the viticulturalist at Vineworks. After their presentations, there will be a Q&A session, so you can ask your questions then. To ask your questions, down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little Q&A icon. So click that and type it in, and then I will read out the questions to the two speakers when they finish their presentations. I think that's all I need to do, apart from say that this is being recorded and will be available on the WineGB website next week. I will now hand over to John. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this WineGB webinar. Just a quick introduction of myself and Joel, really, before we get into the meat of this. My name's John Pollard. I'm the vineyard manager at Gusbourne Estate. I've been there since 2004, which was when the first vines were planted. We now have 90 hectares across two sites. We've got 30 hectares in Sussex, 60 hectares in Kent. And I like to think that I've had a bit of experience with harvest work, and hopefully there'll be some information in this webinar which is very useful to you guys out there who will be raring to go with harvest very soon, no doubt. Anyway, I'll pass you over to Joel just to say hello.
Thank you, John, for that, and thank you, Jo, for the quick introduction. So my name is Joel Jorgensen. I'm the operations manager at Vineworks Limited. For those who don't know us, we are vineyard contractors, and we provide services to many, many vineyards across the south of England, everything from vineyard establishment right through to vineyard management and ongoing contract services. With that, lots of contract labour services, and I think that's quite relevant for harvest period, as of course most fruit in the UK gets picked by hand. So over back to you, John, to go through our talks for the day.
Thanks, Joel. So this introduction here, it's just showing the agenda of the points that we'll cover. So we've got bunch sampling and analysis, we've got the planning and logistics, we've got an equipment section. Then towards the end, we've got legal requirements and a short common sense COVID-19 guide as well. There's a fair bit on some of these that will sort of cross over a little bit. But let's get started. So I'll just say a few words about bunch sampling and analysis. So this is obviously very important, and it really starts with, for me, it really starts with flower counts. I'm not going to talk loads about yield estimation because I believe that WineGB have done a webinar on that already. But we essentially start to get a picture of what our harvest will be like round about flowering, and we'll be taking flower counts at that time from each block and calculating the average flower numbers per vine, and then using that based on historical yield averages of bunch weights to build up a picture of what we might be expecting at the end of September, October to come in. We further back that up with lag phase bunch weights. So this is the period just before veraison, and your bunches are formed. They've not started ripening yet, but by taking bunch weights at that time, prior to actually doing the sampling for your sugars and acidity, but taking bunch weights at that time, you can start to build a picture based on the historical weights at the same time as what your increase might be from the lag phase bunch weights through to the harvest bunch weights. And this is the first mention of, really in this presentation, of keeping accurate data and records. And this data, sort of information that you can take at this time, is really crucial for future years planning as well. So the more data you've got historically, 5 years, 10 years going back, you're looking at averages that will be more accurate in your estimations going forwards. With regards to the bunch sampling and analysis, as well as the yield estimation, that's helping everybody get prepared. The vineyard needs to know how many pickers it needs, what sort of time period we're talking about to do the pick, but also the winery really needs to know essentially when harvest is going to start and potentially how much is going to come in from each individual blocks. So it's really important to be on top of this in order to have a nice smooth, or as smooth as possible, run into harvest. Another aspect of this is that in certain years, and depending upon the style of wine that you're making, you might feel the need to commit to some fruit removal prior to harvest. Very, very heavy crops in still wines, you might want to thin those out. From a disease point of view, you might want to thin those out as well. I think probably best, Joel, if we go through to the next slide. So just touching on the calculating of yields aspect, this screen here is a screenshot from Sector Mentor, which is an app that many of you will probably use, some of you might not know about, but it's a very useful app that is on your phone or iPad. You can do your flower counts, your bunch counts using this app on the go rather than having numerous sheets of paper and spreadsheets on the run. And you can see down the left-hand side there, you've got your blocks, your different varieties and clones, and then you'll see next to that is your bunch weight. So this is a screenshot from the web-based version of the app where you can do all the calculations and play about with the data that you've already synced and loaded to the website. And this is a really useful tool to start to drive a little bit of accuracy towards what your yields might be. You can see that you can put in the fourth column in, you can put in expected loss. You might know that a particular area is bad for powdery, or you always get a bit of botrytis there, so you can make an adjustment which will hopefully filter through to a little bit more accuracy on the right hand side where you've got your block weights on your tons per hectare as well. Very useful bit of kit. Next slide, Joel. So just going on to the bunch sampling quickly. What we tend to do at Gusbourne is we'll take anything between 3 and 5 samples prior to starting harvest, and usually the key for starting that is when we're getting pretty close to full colour change in the reds. We take about 6 bunches per block, and we'll take from those, we will take our bunch weights and our acidity and our sugar and our pH. If you've got any variability in your blocks that is really easy to see, symptoms of that, vines lagging behind and colour change lagging behind, you might want to consider taking an individual sample for those struggling areas even within the same block. And when I talk about blocks, I'm talking about variety clone rootstocks. So, you might have a field of Chardonnay, but you might have various different combinations. So each of those combinations is a different block. The ripening parameters that you'll be working to or have in mind will be dictated by your winemaker, which I don't know, might also be yourselves as well. And that's dependent upon the style, whether you're making still, sparkling, sweet wine. And that's really one of those conversations that if you're using a contract winemaker, you really want to be having that conversation months ago to just really clarify exactly what you're aiming for. After the first sample's taken, you get a bit of an idea as to where you are. By the time you get the second samples in, maybe a week apart, you'll be able to start getting an idea of how much sugar is accumulating per day and how much acidity has been degraded a day. And then you can start to put those into spreadsheet, Sector Mentor, or even start using that information to populate a graph. And then you can start to extrapolate out where you will be at the date that you will be at the parameters that you've set, sugar and acidity. That way you can start to build a really accurate picture as to when you'll start harvesting. Also, when you're going through the vineyard, it's always a great opportunity, as any walk through the vineyard is to really have a very good close check on how the crop is doing. So all these actions of going through to collect the fruit, you can always be looking at for other items of interest. And a good idea, keeping your eye out for the start of disease, the start of botrytis kicking in, and that might help influence picking schedules as well. I think Joel will cover a little bit more on disease later on in the presentation. Also, just the final point there that I've touched on already, the bunch weights at sampling. Every time you're taking samples during towards the end of veraison, you're starting to drive more accuracy to your yield estimates using your flower counts and bunch counts that you've done previously in the year. I think, Joel, that's over to you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Joel. That graph's quite useful, actually. That just shows you how you might be able to plot that information on the graph. Again, this is from Sector Mentor, and that's automatically taking your readings and putting them into a graph form so that you can start to see what the curve is looking like for each of those varieties and start to get some accuracy to your potential and preferred picking dates as well. Okay, Joel.
Great, thank you, John, for that. So I'd like to talk to you initially about planning for harvest, particularly with relation to logistics, and then determining how many pickers to get on site. Obviously, some people do pick by machine, but many vineyards, I'd say 99%, would harvest all of their fruit by hand. And I think it's a really important part of getting everything right for harvest is really understanding picking rates, and really knowing how much fruit a picker can realistically pick in a day is quite an important part, obviously, of determining how many pickers to organize. Now, of course, there are various factors that will influence the speed or the rate of picking per person. We've had the very fortunate position at Vineworks to have oversight of, gosh, nearly 90 vineyards that we harvest every year over the last sort of 10, 12 years. Myself have been involved for probably since 2014. So I've really built up quite a good picture of the different picking rates. And I think the few of the most important factors there would be whether or not both sides of the canopy have been leaf stripped and whether your canopy management has been tidy and uniform across the block. Of course, that will mean faster picking if there's no foliage in the way. What you'll often find, like that picture on the bottom left, that's been nicely leaf stripped on the east side of every row. Many sites choose to neglect the west side of every row. And what you often find there is that the two pickers, who very often work in pairs opposite each other, the picker on the east side finds his job really easy because the fruit is visible, whereas the picker on the west might lag behind, and that can have quite an influence on your speed. The other influential part would be diseased fruit. So, of course, if you've got lots of botrytis that your pickers are having to sift through and cut out with their secateurs, that will significantly slow them down. And then one of the biggest factors, which is often overlooked as well, is the actual bunch weight. So from a very simple perspective, if you look at it, it takes the same amount of time to pick a tiny 50 or 60 gram bunch as it does to pick a bunch like that one in the picture on the right, which is a real photograph of a real bunch in the UK, and that was 1.7 kilograms. Of course, that was a freak find with a freak bunch, but the picking rate can vary as little as 20 kilos per person per hour for diseased fruit on a messy canopy, right up to sort of 70 kilos per hour for clean fruit. And in years like 2018, where we had lots of large bunches and the fruit was very clean, we certainly noticed that the average picking rate was a lot quicker. And of course, people were dropping the number of pickers that they actually needed from us. So it's all part of proper planning, really understanding how your fruit looks out there so that you can confidently book the right number of people to do the job. Many contractors might ask for an 8-hour minimum day for their pickers. So that's equally quite important to make sure you get the right number of workers for a nice tidy day. And you also have to bear in mind that your winemaker might want to go to sleep at night and not be pressing fruit all night. So of course you want to get the right number of pickers to bring that fruit in on time. And then the other thing people-wise that you need to have ready for the day is, of course, ground crew. Once you've picked all that fruit into the crates or bins, you'll need a certain number of people to collect those full crates and then transfer them onto trailers, or for example, how Gusbourne like to do it. If they had, say, a crew of 30 or 40 pickers, then they would have bucket runners, probably 6 or 7 bucket runners, one placed in each row. And those guys would be running full buckets of grapes into their picking bin trailers. So for example, with a team size of 30 to 40, with 7 bucket runners, they would pick an average of about 12 to 16 tons on any given day. On to picking crates. Another important thing to remember building up to harvest is obviously you want to buy your crates long in advance. You should all have them in stock already for this season. And the choice of crates as well really is horses for courses. The small hobbyist vineyard, sort of under 2 hectares, I would deem as a hobbyist, you might not be able to afford the big expensive equipment. You might not think it appropriate to go and get the big trailers with big bins, in which case you might be carrying out small picking crates, like that picture on the left there, and you can create a human train without even the need for a tractor. That's quite useful on a small site, particularly where you've got short rows. But of course, it's not all that efficient and quite labor intensive, which can of course be costly. If you're then a slightly bigger vineyard, perhaps sort of 5 to 10 hectares, you might be looking at the picking small plastic crates as well, similar crates to the hobbyists, but you might be moving them on a tractor and trailer, or perhaps tractor and forks, like in that second picture over there. But of course, these little pet crates, although they're great, you run a few risks, like once you've got a fully stacked pallet of crates behind a tractor. Tractors are, of course, quite bouncy in a bumpy vineyard. If they're stacked quite tall, sort of 6 or 7 crates high, you do run the risk of them tipping over. And of course, all the health and safety implications of that can be a bit scary. Not least, picking up grapes off the floor is never fun. So then moving on to the more commercial sized vineyards, they would definitely be looking at something a bit more efficient, like those bins in the second and third picture there. These bins are, of course, the most efficient way to move the fruit to your lorries out of the vineyard, and then equally more efficient for your telehandler or forklift in the field to load onto your lorry or big tractor and trailer. The reason I say they're more efficient and quicker to load is that your forklift can physically drive faster with a bin like that than he could drive with an unstable pallet full of smaller crates. And when picking with those smaller crates, a very important thing to remember is that you need lots and lots of pallet wrap, and that's often overlooked with those things. But of course, the more pallet wrap you've got on there, the more stable they are. Over to that picture on the far right, that's an example of, I believe that's actually at Gusbourne, with 2 of our pickers there on the, or bucket runners on the trailer there. That is by far the most efficient way to do it, where they've got self-unloading trailers as they get to the sort of loading area, and then the lorries take the fruit from there. So when choosing where to find or source your labourers, most fruit, of course, is picked by hand in the UK. Many people would be choosing contractors, a professional company designed to go and pick fruit and do all the labour tasks in a vineyard. Others might have enough internal staff if perhaps they're a slightly smaller vineyard and they can draw on family and friends. And then others might choose to use local people, and that's, I think, a great way of doing it as well. So just a brief comparison of the 3 of those options. Contractors, of course, are very easy to deal with. You generally have one point of contact, which I think goes a long way when you're juggling many things at harvest, especially as a vineyard manager. It can be quite stressful. Having one point of contact means you haven't got to make hundreds of phone calls every time your picking days change. And as you all know, working around the weather can be a bit of a nightmare anyway. Then, of course, with contractors, you're likely to be getting a labour team who knows what they're doing. It won't be their first vineyard that they're seeing. Chances are they've been to 10 others before they get to yours. And, of course, a critical thing is that they're going to be reliable. They're paid to be there. They've got a reputation to uphold. And they're going to rock up when they say they will. And they will stay all day until the fruit is picked. And if not, your contractor will make a plan to get it done. Us, particularly at Vineworks, as far as I know, we've never let a vineyard down at harvest time. That can't necessarily be said for locals, as I'm sure some of you experience, and some of you have had better experiences than others. There are a few commercial vineyards that do solely rely on locals at harvest. I think it's for a number of reasons, it is great where you can have a really great relationship with your community, and it's good for PR. And certainly somebody who's helped pick a bunch of grapes, they're not far more likely to buy one of those bottles afterwards. So that's great. But of course, when you have adverse weather conditions or heavy rains, they can be a little bit unreliable. And once you give them that lovely harvest lunch and a bottle of wine, they're unlikely to go back into the field. So it potentially could be a bit of a false economy. Either way, whether you're using contractors or locals, I think that choice is really determined by how many picking days you've got and how reliable you think that needs to be. And it really does just further drill home the points that John made earlier, that accurate yield estimates and calculations are so important in lining all of those factors up. Moving on to the condition of the fruit on picking day. Of course, leading up to picking day, as John says, you're scouting your blocks, you're doing your yield forecasts, and you're checking the quality of your fruit. Now, important quality parameters are, of course, your disease as well. Certain diseases can be picked out while they're harvesting. Other things are a little bit more tricky to spot, like SWD, for example. A berry that's been infected or had a egg laid in it from a spotted wing Drosophila can be very, very hard to spot on a bunch of grapes, and chances are the pickers will miss it. So again, just proper vineyard management leading up to that is important. And I think something that people often overlook is, or don't clarify with their winemaker, is you need to set clear parameters of what quality of fruit is actually acceptable in the press or in the pick and crate and what isn't. And I think that really needs to be agreed up front rather than trying to deliver dodgy grapes and having them turned away. I do actually have a story about that, which was quite a sore point for a particular grower a few years ago, where they had a significant amount of powdery mildew. I don't know if you can see it clearly in that picture on the bottom left, but that is a bunch of Pinot Noir from this particular chap's vineyard a few years ago. It is absolutely riddled with powdery, and unfortunately most of his blocks looked like that, and he was selling his fruit, contracted to be sold to a large commercial winery. He overlooked or didn't read the contract, told our pickers to put all that fruit in the crates, although we advised him not to. He of course is being paid per ton, expected that fruit to be picked, so we did, and unfortunately nearly £80,000 worth of grapes were turned away from the winery that day, or over those days, and it cost him quite a lot of money, of course. Not something you want when viticulture can be marginal. So anyway, other parameters that you're looking at, aside from disease pressure, would of course be your ripening parameters. You're monitoring that as you go. Once you've selected a prime picking date and your sugar levels are optimum, you might then have, say, heavy rain forecast. You might get a little bit stressed and think, oh, that heavy rain could actually soak up into my fruit, dilute my juice, and your sugar levels could actually potentially go down, as well as dropping out the acid. So it's all about understanding what the weather's doing, looking at your options, and thorough communication with both your winemaker and whoever's picking your fruit, and then picking a date accordingly. If you have got diseased fruit, the best way to select the best bunches and the cleanest bunches and the ripest bunches are, of course, by hand. Much like in those pictures there, in the second photo with the chap here picking, he's harvesting the fruit and thinning out any disease. Then you've got a supervisor next to him, further checking those crates, making sure that the quality of the pick is good. And then on the far right, you can see a lady there, one of our pickers, picking out some botrytis from a bunch of grapes before putting it into the crate. And I think communication across the board is really important, making sure that you understand what your winemaker is expecting and that your pickers understand what is expected of them. Over to equipment for you, John. I think you're muted there, John.
I saw that earlier and I thought I wouldn't get caught out by it, but there we go. So machine or hand picking. At Gusbourne a few years ago, we did do an experiment with the machine, which worked brilliantly for a small amount of still wine that we made that year. But the quality of the juice wasn't really there for our sparkling wine, so it wasn't something that we've progressed with any further. But there are probably maybe one or two contractors that provide machine harvesting services, and I think there's probably a handful of vineyards as well that have their own machines. And I think there will be more machines available as future years roll on, especially as maybe more still wine has been made as a proportion of the sparkling, which seems to be the predominant form in the UK at the moment. But anyway, both have got their advantages, but I think we're really going to focus a little bit more on the hand picking here. Snips, dead simple bit of kit, but one thing that really annoys me is if we end up with a load of the nut and bolt style scissors. So the fulcrum, if you like, the pivot point on the snips that are shown in the bottom left there are the pressed rivet, which are nice and reliable, whereas we've often had some nut and bolt styles which have been a bit problematic in the fact that the bolt and nut sometimes come undone. It can be a bit annoying. Other thing just to concern yourselves with there is just keeping some lubricant on hand, WD-40 or something like that, or a quick swirl in a bucket of water is enough to get rid of some of the sugar that can often stick them together. One important thing that we really don't want to do is put a pair of snips into the press, especially if it's a bag press, which a lot of you will probably be using. And that's a surefire way to really annoy your winemaker with a burst bag. Hopefully they've got one sitting on the shelf as a spare, but it's still downtime that you don't really want at a very busy time of year. So we generally count the snips out, we count them back in again. We use a dead simple system, a block of sort of 4x4 wood, lots of holes drilled in, numbered, and we know how many numbers of snips have gone out in the morning, and we want to count them back in at the end of the day. Buckets, dead simple bit of kit. Get more than you need. They're not immune to being run over by a tractor. They need to be washed at the end of the day. They can get a bit sticky and stinky if you leave them, use them day after day. Also, especially with regards to COVID-19, we want to be washing them, disinfecting them each day. Next slide there, Joel, I think, please. So some more logistics here. Pallet bins or harvest crates, that's been touched on briefly by Joel. We've used both. In the early years when we started, we used small crates, and we moved over to the pallet bins as soon as essentially we got our own winery established at Gusbourne, and we were able to design the winery in such a way that we could load the press, like the picture in there of the forklift tipping the crates with a rotating head. And this was driven by efficiency, but probably above all else, safety. I've been in the vineyard and dropped some stacks of palletized crates of fruit, and we've been lucky that we've not had any accidents, essentially. But since we've had the pallet bins working in the vineyards, very easy to use, very easy to move about, very safe. One point there is with regards to just thinking about, especially if your crates are going off site, if your winery isn't within your sort of vineyard boundary, if you like, if your crates are being hauled to another, to a contract winemaker, is just to think about how many crates you actually need. If you're harvesting day after day, you need to know that you've got enough crates in the bank to get the second day and the third day completed before those crates are returned by the haulier. So that's one thing just to be aware of. Also, with regards to transportation of fruit to the winery, if it's not within the same estate, you need to get hold of a very good haulage contractor, and there's lots of them out there. We've used a number over the years, and they want as much specifics about timings and transports and weights as the winery does, really, because they need to know what they're taking. They also need to know that they're not overloaded, which can be quite easy to do, especially if you're estimating the weights of fruit and relying upon the winery to do the exact weights at the other end. And I think the other thing there is just you've got to manage the lorry driver's expectations. Most of them are really into it, and they're really interested in taking a load of grapes from a vineyard to a winery, because they don't generally do that their day-to-day job. So it is a bit of interest for them, but you do need to have them on site for longer than you would do if you're just loading a pallet of wine onto them and waving bye-bye to them. So, you know, our guys, we might be sending 2 lorries from the Sussex Vineyard to the Appledore Winery at Gusbourne, and we might have 2 lorries during the day, and one will be start getting loaded at about 11 o'clock in the morning, and won't be ready to leave until 2. And the next lorry will turn up at 2 and won't leave till 6. So it's just a case of being up front and letting the hauliers know. Good haulier will have a pretty good idea, especially if they've dealt with any vineyards in the past. They'll know what to expect, which is good. Also, just to bear in mind the amount of fruit that you can pick in one day. And that's, along with the parameters of sugar and acidity, is a discussion with your winemaker. Make sure that you're not going to overpick, and you know, the last thing they want is half a ton left over that they couldn't squeeze into the last press, and their team's got to stay around for another 4 hours to process that. So that's just a little bit of forethought there, just to understand what exactly is your tonnage limit per day. Okay, Joel. I think that's back to you, Joel, legal requirements.
That's back to me. Thank you, John. So I'll just touch briefly on some of the legal requirements that you need to have lined up for your harvest day. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, so please don't rely on only this and swat up yourselves as well. But just a few things that often get overlooked. One really important thing in terms of documentation is your spray records. You need to have these on hand for your winemaker. If they are going to be processing your product, they want to be 100% certain that what you've been spraying isn't still within its harvest interval and could potentially ruin a batch of wine. And they also want to be 100% certain that the products you've sprayed and the amount of each product you've sprayed has been adhered to as per the product labels. There are some products, and I think the harvest interval factor is an important thing when choosing your picking date. Some products like Mancozeb, for example, might have an 8-week harvest interval, or 56 days, I think it is. And of course, if you go and spray that in late September, you're not going to be picking until November. So you need to be careful with that sort of thing. We record all of our spray records on a Google form, which is saved on our workers' phones, so that makes it really quick and easy. The data gets automatically saved on a spreadsheet and shared with our clients straight away, and that's a live, ongoing thing. So that's a really convenient and easy way to do it. You can also share that with your winemaker, so you don't have to constantly keep updating them. They can just check it and have access to it at any given time. And then as far as the paperwork's concerned, I've got a few examples down there. I know you probably can't read them, but they're just for demonstration, really. The first one being the CAD form, which is a commercial accompanying document, or WSB 15. And if you want to get hold of this form, you can download it from the internet. If you go onto the Food Standards Agency website, .gov.uk, I think it is. Otherwise, just Google WSB 15 CAD form and you'll find it. This is particularly important if your fruit is being transported off-site to a winery more than 25 miles away. But it's worth sending a copy of this form with your lorry driver anyway, because if in the unfortunate circumstance that there might be an accident on the road and the fruit is spilled all over the road, the emergency services will want to know what that lorry was transporting so that they can deal with it accordingly. Of course, grapes are slightly less hazardous than a tanker full of oil or something. So that's an important consideration there. With that form, you'll want to fill out one copy for your own records and one copy to give to the driver, and the driver should pass that on to the winery upon receival of the fruit. The easiest way to do that is fill out one form, take a photograph, and keep a photo for yourselves. The next form would be your harvest declaration form, which I believe you've got until January of the following year to fill out. However, best do that whilst the records are still fresh in your mind. And this is a form that you have to fill out if it's being processed at a winery off-site rather than on-site. And then the production declaration, or WSB 21, is something that the winemaker would need to complete every time they're making a batch of wine. On to some of the other legal requirements, the health and safety out in the field. So, of course, every vineyard should have their own risk assessment, as well as every contractor should have done their own risk assessments. But really, it's down to each vineyard to make that general assessment more site-specific, and they should also have laid out their standard operating procedures. Now, that's a really good process to go through anyway, because it helps you put down on paper exactly every step of your harvest process and really helps you organize things. Now, you also, of course, need to provide training to all of the people on site. Generally, your contractor should have done training before they turn up, so that's one thing you don't need to be too concerned about. However, if you have any different or unusual practices, then of course you'll want to make your staff aware of that. And anybody who's done any health and safety training must sign the form to say that they've done that, and you'll want that available if the HSE comes knocking. Other things you want to have prepared in advance would be your first aid kits. Of course, you want them to hand, not in the back of somebody's car. You want them available in the field and ready to go. My best advice would be to always have more than you think. Perhaps hang them on the ends of the rows so they're accessible, and make sure all the supervisors are aware of where they are, where to find them, and how to use them. Ideally, have a few trained first aiders on site too. Lots and lots and lots of blue food grade plasters. I say blue food grade because there's nothing worse than a plaster landing up in a batch of wine. It's a bit gross. So at least if it's blue, it's more likely to be spotted and picked out. There's less chance of any dodgy taints coming from the plaster as well. Then one thing that we really appreciate as contractors is having the correct number of toilets on site. Again, this is actually a legal requirement, and I think the minimum recommendation there is at least one toilet for every 7 workers per week. Ideally, you'd have separate toilets for ladies and gents, especially if you're having bigger crews as well. And then particularly relevant this year with COVID-19, you want to organise regular cleaning and sterilising, ideally between each use, but that might not always be feasible. But in general, of course, a nice clean toilet, everybody will appreciate that, and generally a happy harvest team is a productive harvest team. Then this year, again, more relevant than ever, hand washing facilities. So not only to wash the sticky juice off the pickers' hands before they, the sticky grape juice, before they eat their lunch, but particularly with COVID, they'll want to be able to wash and sterilize their hands as often as possible. And I think many stations there would be valuable. High-vis bibs, not necessarily each picker would need a bib, although at Vineworks we will be supplying every picker with a high-vis bib. I think most importantly, the ground crew or anyone working anywhere near a tractor should certainly, your bucket runners and your crate runners should have high-vis bibs, not to be run over by your tractor. And then likewise for those same people, you'd want some safety boots in case a tractor trailer ran over their toes. And then something that often gets overlooked but is really quite useful is supplying lots of the blue nitrile gloves, ideally nitrile rather than latex because they're non-allergenic. And again, blue gloves because they can be spotted if they did end up in a picking crate or anywhere in the field if they get dropped. So that's quite useful there. Not least, they keep the sticky juice off of your hands, and some of the juice can get a bit irritating. So over to you, John, for COVID-19.
Thanks, Joel. As Joel mentioned with the health and safety side of things, legal requirements, this list here isn't exhaustive, and it's really just to ensure that you've got the basic points there. But obviously I'm not trying to teach anybody to suck eggs. We're all sensible people, but just a quick run through here. I think the main thing to check there is that the current advice is likely to change or possibly change before we get underway with harvest. And I've been keeping an eye on the HSE websites, Public Health England, although that body has been disbanded now, but also the NFU has some useful information as well. And also, if you are a member of the NFU, don't forget that they've got a call first a phone number that you can ring and actually speak to somebody and get some advice in the first instance is very useful from them. Essentially, if workers have got a high temperature, they shouldn't be attending your place of work, whether they're locals or contractors. I know that speaking to the contractors like Joel and Paul at Vinecare, that those temperatures will be checked before they leave. So if there is somebody with a high temperature, they won't even be getting on the bus. Also, with regards that, the big groups of pickers that are coming into your place of work, they should be travelling in their own cohort or sitting together on the bus at least, wearing face masks. And those cohorts are generally those that live together and travel together. Even coming back to simple things like the hand washing facilities, we are probably tripling the number of hand washing stations that we've got at Gusbourne, so that the cohorts can essentially go as a cohort to an individual tap. So we're just trying to mitigate any sort of mixing of people as much as we possibly can during break times, lunch times, and even beginning and end of day as well. So that hygiene really is at the forefront of what we need to be doing. Also, simple things like the snips. If we're giving out snips at the beginning of the day, we're going to be trying to rigorously enforce that those snips stay with that individual. Another layer of protection there is a blue nitrile gloves that Joel has spoken about. Those snips need to be washed and disinfected at the end of each picking day so they're ready for the next day. The same goes for the buckets, which I mentioned earlier. Also, in the situation where you are picking either into harvest bins or into small crates, quite often buckets will be involved, and those buckets, if you're picking into larger bins or they've been taken away by a crew that's running buckets, those buckets are going to get rotated and circulated throughout the whole team. So they very much need disinfecting and cleaning at the end of each day, and it's a must for the staff that are running buckets that they should be wearing the blue nitrile gloves during the working day. Requirement of masks when working outside. I saw some pictures from Bordeaux, which started harvesting some of their white varieties the other day, and a number of the workers were wearing masks. I'm very much of the mind that when we tend to pick in this country, we're picking a single row, and there's people working opposite each other on that row. And I think the easiest way to mitigate any transmission there is that we make sure that those people are staggered so they're not working completely opposite each other. But also we've got to remember that the pickers are working outside in the outdoor environment. They've got a canopy of leaves in front of them between them and their picking partner. But also I think just for added safety, we need to try and stagger those working pairs. Essentially, I think I've pretty much covered everything on that list. And like I said, that's sort of common sense material there. Unless Joel has anything further to add, I think we're pretty much at the end of our presentation. We just want to say thanks for listening. Thanks for attending the webinar, and, wish you all the best for a successful and happy and safe harvest. Hello, Joe.
Hello, I'm back. Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing your words of wisdom on this. I'm just checking the questions. We don't have any, so I guess you absolutely covered everything.
Great.
So that's brilliant. If you want to download a list of sort of information on operating a harvest during these sort of COVID times, go to the WineGB website, and Vinecare have provided quite a comprehensive list as well that you can have a look at on that. So this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on the WineGB website very soon. And oh, we have a question, so bear with me. We have a question. I'm just trying to read it. There's a few typos. Do you have any template for risk assessments?
Yeah, did you want to go for that, John? Or?
Well, I'm happy. I mean, we've got a risk assessment which includes pretty much everything within our business, of which harvest is one of. We've got a basic version that is the type of thing that I would share with people like Vineworks and Vinecare, so that they would know what we are putting into place, and Vine Care, Vine Works will also share that sort of thing with us as well. I don't know if have you got anything that's organised to be sent, Joel? I can sort something out if necessary.
Yes, I think we as contractors, of course, have our own risk assessments that we run for, that sort of covers us on every single site. And of course, we provide the staff training before they go out to site. In terms of an actual risk assessment template, I think the easiest place to get them from are the likes of NFU or somebody like that. They very often have that sort of thing to hand. Otherwise, there are many downloadable risk assessments online if you simply Google it. Yeah. But yes, we share ours with any of our clients, and happy to share with anybody who needs. It's frozen there, I think.
I think that though we don't have any further questions, because although you might see 4 questions, it's actually referred to the same thing on risk assessments. So I think that we can now say thank you very much to everyone attending. Thank you also to John and Joel. And I will close this webinar down now. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.